core challenge for us around how we think about digital productivity and using digital productivity as a driver of reviving our lagging productivity as an economy. But also a really fascinating question about how we think about productivity drivers arising from the value of creativity and design, and how we change the way the community values creativity and design in terms of value added in what we produce, and of course how that then contributes to greater competitiveness. Around competitiveness, it's fascinating when you look at the national policy agenda that national competition policy, which was so firmly on the agenda in the 1990s, has now almost disappeared from our language. And it's time we rethought that as we go through, as I'll mention shortly, major challenges with national structural adjustment arising from climate change and a lot of the major megatrends we confront. So what I've been doing lately is asking myself some fairly basic questions, like what is shaping changing innovation markets? I think it's interesting to think about markets for innovation. How is the game changing? And what are the implications of that for what we do? And what are some of our possible blind spots? And the importance of how we go back to some basics. So let me try, in the brief time I have, to cover off on some of those points. I'll take as my kick-off point some really interesting work we've been doing in CSIRO in terms of developing a forward strategic agenda for CSIRO science investment. And we went through this novel but highly interesting process of saying, what are some of the global megatrends to which science and research needs to respond? And these have provided a really interesting platform for discussion with industry and a whole range of players about how we focus our research agenda. And so I thought, as a thought experiment, it's quite interesting to say, well, how might it affect the research agenda that we think about as a Centre for Creative Industries and Innovation? We had 5 mega trends. All the issues around a resource-constrained future, and a future in which we've got to get more from less, whether it's energy, water, food, whatever. And the massive structural adjustment agenda that implies, going back to my point about competition policy and productivity earlier, and how innovation in all its aspects is going to be crucial in responding to that challenge. The second mega trend we identified was around the personalisation of services and products, and a whole neglected area of innovation in the services economy, the services sector. And what to me, one of the really interesting areas of that is around some of the areas we totally neglect, like the huge component of services markets around personal services, including areas like increasingly aged care, preventative health, personal training, and cosmetic redesign. It's like fascinating, for example, if you look at plastic surgery and so forth, the 3 major markets in the world that lead that are the US, China, in Brazil. So even markets for cosmetic redesign, and all of them, those personal service markets, are increasingly, of course, technology-based and driven. And so the professionalisation of personal services as an innovation challenge and opportunity is an interesting, quirky area. Of course, we then have the phenomenon of ageing populations, but also, and much more important, I think, the fact that people are living longer. I find it extraordinary to reflect that from 1900 to 2000, the average life expectancy increased by 30 years. And when you think about it, that is pretty extraordinary. And what that means for what sort of quality of life people are going to be looking for, and what they're going to demand, and how we enhance that quality of life, and the whole of life productivity and creativity of people. We then, of course, have the global phenomenon of urbanisation, and for the first time ever, the bulk of the world's population is now living in cities, and cities, or our city forms, are becoming less and less workable. Congestion, all sorts of problems. But the challenge of how we reinvent the city is huge, and of course, all the discussion that we have around creative cities, how we create innovative cities, and cities that house productive social capital. Huge challenge, but great area of opportunity. And finally, of course, the fact that we live in a digital era, and where everything in the natural world is going to have a digital counterpart. And so that convergence of the natural and the digital, and what that means, particularly in terms of just the deluge of data. And I'll come back to the implications of that as well. Now, when we looked at, as a board, at these mega trends that the team had put together, we said, but the flip side of mega trends is also the issue of mega shocks. What are the uncertainties that are always going to confront us? Those mega shocks, it's not a question of whether they're going to happen or not, but when. And there's been very little work done in this area until the World Economic Forum did a little bit, and then more recently the OECD brought out a series of really interesting papers around 5 areas: pandemics, cyber terrorism, which of course has been a bit in the news of late, financial crises, which we see not diminishing, but in fact growing in terms of the US, Europe and China, the ever-present issue around socio-economic unrest and the geopolitical implications of that. We've seen that in the Middle East and other places. And then just horrendous natural disasters, whether they're, and someone raised, very relevant to Australia, what happens when the next Krakatoa goes off in our region, as an example. But the implication for that, in terms of our people capabilities and our research agenda, is how do we invest in preparedness around potential mega shocks? Just take pandemics as a really good example. How do you invest in the sort of capabilities and platforms that would enable you to respond effectively? And more broadly, in that question of investing in developing resilience, and I think if you look at the resilience arising from the rich social capital in Finland has been demonstrated over the last few days. It's a really good example of the challenge. And I see a lot of the challenge here has been, how do we invest far more in social capital, put far more attention in our innovation and research agendas into building and nurturing social capital as being intimately associated with developing intellectual capital. So let me summarise some of the ways I'm seeing the innovation game changing. Fundamentally, and I'm sort of grappling with this, but I think it's a really interesting phenomenon that we're not talking enough about, is how the whole business of science and research is changing. For the last 300 years, we've basically had models of science and scientific method that have been built around the mechanical and physical sciences. Over the last few decades, the whole focus has shifted to the life sciences. And of course there we're talking about very different phenomena. We're talking not about closed but about open adaptive living systems. And this convergence then between the biological sciences and the human sciences and social sciences. Then we face the challenge that basically in research and science we've learned how to do all the easy bits, the well-defined problems. We know how to get answers to those. What remains is how we deal with those broad, wicked problems as they're described, like population ageing, like climate change, and so forth, where there's no right or wrong answer. There's only a good solution or a less good solution, and where to actually come up with those solution options, you need to bring together a much more broadly based, cross-disciplinary group of people, and also include all the key stakeholders. Now this implies a totally different approach to research and research funding than that which our traditional institutional frameworks support. And associated with that, of course, is then the whole issue around complexity, because wicked problems are by definition complex, and how we deal with complex systems. And related to that, of course, is the emergence of the whole domain of services science. So I see profound shifts in the nature of the business of science and research, and I don't think we've spent nearly enough time to date in saying what does that mean for us in terms of what we do, how we fund what we do, and how we organise and coordinate it. The next one I want to highlight is just this one about the data deluge. And we're moving to a world where research and so much of our life is going to be just swamped with data as we go fully digital. So we see some leading edge examples of this already. We're building this new square kilometre array telescope in Western Australia. In less than 1 week, it'll collect more data from space than we have collected to date. Totally. That would be too much data to actually store and reanalyse. And, okay, that's going to spread everywhere. As we build sensor networks where everything has an intelligent digital identity, think about the amount of data that's going to accumulate so that we can no longer look at that in terms of nice, neat, traditional experimentation. We're going to have to think